A fractured United States is at war with itself. That's the premise of Alex Garland's Civil War, #1 at the US box office. A bit weird, considering its unusual heroes. War photographers.
Someone said, don't make it about journalists, everybody hates journalists.
Now, journalism can't end a civil war, but if it fails, the movie seems to say, one is more likely to start.
We don't ask. We record so other people ask.
It's an imaginary scenario, but it looks disturbingly real. So I talked about it with some of today's most important war photographers. Incredible people who filmed real wars, assassinations and genocides. They have been shot, bombed, kidnapped.
That's coming from someone who's been kidnapped twice.
I was not able to stop people from being executed.
Some of them are risking their lives right now. So how does their job actually look like? And how accurate is the movie? Just a quick warning, we are gonna discuss details from the movie, so expect spoilers. And we're also gonna look at war photos, so expect images of violence. So, did you like the movie?
I liked the movie.
Powerful and unsettling.
Kirsten Dunst did an incredible job.
One of the things that was so realistic about the film were these summarily executions that happened so fast with no conversation.
The relationship between the more experienced photographer and the younger photographer.
The fragility of life and how people can go from living to dead in seconds.
The monotony of sort of driving through a war zone.
You're planning with your fixer or the reporter you happen to be working with, any one of your team, a driver.
Everything is more intense, and so relationships evolve at a faster rate.
Having been a photographer working on January 6th, being inside the Capitol, there's some remnants and some similarities.
They got a lot right, and that's more than most films do when it comes to photojournalists.
There were some certain things that did not make sense.
We're talking about Hollywood, right? We're talking about a very violent film.
It's not that realistic that journalists are given that front row seat to violence right off the bat.
There are times when we're wearing flak jackets and helmets, other times we're not, without any kind of rhyme or reason.
She has her sort of breakdown at the end of the movie while she's still on assignment. I don't think that's when you would fall apart as a very experienced war photographer. I think that would obviously happen during the quiet moments back at home.
The fact that there was no medical kit, there was no effort to even stop the bleeding.
They didn't really give the characters time to converse with civilians.
But one of the biggest things, of course, is that if there's a siege on the White House, if there are only 4 or 5 journalists there, in today's day and age, with everybody that has a phone, everybody that has a camera, seems literally impossible.
Okay, now let's zoom in on 5 scenes of the movie from beginning to end, so I can ask you how realistic they are and use them to talk about war photography in general. We are towards the beginning of the movie, and Lee, the experienced journalist, meets for the first time Jessie, the aspiring photographer, and saves her life from a suicide bombing. Unfortunately, I cannot show the next part of the clip because it's not in the promotional material. We'll have to get ingenious with the whole video in that sense, but I have a picture right here, and I'll send it to you as well. But in any case, immediately after the bomb went off, while Jessie is still shocked, Lee is already photographing the dead bodies littering the road. So how realistic is that? Would you go out and shoot pictures in a situation like that?
I photographed a suicide bombing years ago. Former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, was assassinated by a suicide bomber who also shot her with a pistol. And I was very close to the vehicle when that happened. She was waving from an open armored car, and I saw the panic in her driver's eye. So I backed up, and from the moment I noticed that problem, where I was about, a couple yards away from the vehicle, to when the explosion happened was only 10 seconds. And so I moved back, and it saved me because I followed some intuition. And after that explosion, I was pushed back in a stampede. But then I had the choice, which is the choice that you see in the film, of going in and continuing working or just calling it a day. And I made that choice to go in and photograph what I could see in the distance. And so Would I do that again today? I'm not sure. And why is that? Because as we've seen in Ukraine, we saw it in Syria, we see it in Gaza as well. It's called the double tap. When there is a bomb that comes in, or an airstrike, or a suicide bombing, people like photojournalists and first responders go in, and then a second one happens.
That's incredible. Can you share? That's really incredible. Can you share more episodes like that? I'd really like our viewers to know what risks you have taken. So is there any moment that stands out, or you thought, why the hell am I doing this job?
And I would say when I was kidnapped in Libya in 2011 during the popular uprising, for about a week, it was unclear whether we would survive. I was taken hostage with 3 colleagues from the New York Times. So Tyler Hicks, Anthony Shadid, and Steve Farrell. Right sort of at the moment of our kidnapping, we were put on the ground execution style, with each one of us had a gun to our head, and they were about to execute us. And I think in that moment, I was pretty sure that I would not survive. And I didn't say in that moment I would quit, but I definitely asked myself, like, wow, I really need to ask myself why I'm here, and like why I'm risking my life. Because my family, I thought of my parents in that moment, and I thought, what will they think when they hear their daughter's been killed in Ajdabia, a place in Libya that no one's ever heard of? At the end of that, when we were finally released, ironically, I never said, I'm quitting.
I've been taken prisoner a number of times. I've had governments have to negotiate for my release.
Any risky moment that stood out?
Not really, because there have been so many different moments. I've documented over 25 conflicts. I've worked in over 100 countries. People often ask, where was the most dangerous? What was the most close to this or close to that? And I've been very blessed, very lucky, not to have been injured, obviously not to have been killed. Many of my colleagues have unfortunately suffered the ultimate sacrifice. And these situations, whether it could be a bullet going by too closely, shrapnel landing too closely, all these different things, that they are part of the risks that come along depending on the situation.
Why do you take such risks? I mean, I understand a soldier fighting for his country, but why do you go to so many countries, to different wars, and different wars in many countries? So why does one decide to risk their life over and over again?
The interest and fascination in violence and war, that's one of those things that I have no answer to. Like, objectively speaking, I find the interest strange, a bit off-putting, kind of messed up on some level. Like, why be attracted and dedicate my life to the very thing that most people are trying to get away from? Why volunteer to do this thing? Why do it over and over again? Why do it for decades? Why do it after friends die? Why do it after being hurt? Why do it after like mentally being scarred? It makes no sense. So the answer to your question is that I have no answer, because it makes no sense. It's who I am, and you have to be who you are on some level.
But we would be remiss to not talk about the fact that no international journalists are allowed to report from Gaza. It is the only war in history where fought by a democratic country where journalists are not allowed in. I think the statistics show that journalists have been targeted now more than ever. I think it's incredibly important to talk about the fact that journalists are also targeted with impunity, and no one ever gets taken to task. No one ever gets convicted of killing a journalist. Personally, I believe it should be a war crime. But that's coming from someone who's been kidnapped twice and once by forces loyal to Gaddafi when he was still in power, because they didn't like our coverage. And that's really important, because a lot of these journalists are being killed because governments don't want their coverage to get out. And so I think that that's very important to understand why journalists are being killed, because it's to censor and it's to stop people from getting coverage. And Gaza, more journalists have been killed than any other war in history, almost 100 journalists between Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon, and a majority of them, of course, in Gaza. So it's important to talk about.
Yeah, we actually managed to get in touch with someone there to get their perspective Well, obviously not on the movie, but on the general topics we're covering here.
Let's just ask him. If you can tell me a bit about yourself, Mohammed. Where are you from? Are you from Gaza? Or if not, how did you end up there?
إذا فيك تخبرنا عن حالك ومن وين أنت تحديداً؟
أنا اسمي محمد المصري، سكان غزة الشمال، مدينة بيت لاهيا اللي هي أقصى شمال غزة.
Are you safe?
الاحتلال يقتل ويقصف في كل مكان في غزة، لا يوجد مكان آمن. وأنا أتحدث إليكم الآن ممكن يتم قصفنا في هذه اللحظة. يعني صراحة كثير لحظات عشتها كنا في خطر، لكن أصعب الأوقات اللي هي كانت لما تحاصرنا في مستشفى الشفاء. لما تحاصرت أنا في مستشفى الشفاء وفي نفس الليلة قصفونا بمدفعية في قذيفة مدفعية، لكن نجونا بأعجوبة إنه القذيفة لم تنفجر. يعني لو انفجرت القذيفة لم أكن أتحدث إليكم الآن.
You risk your life even more to take these photos. Why?
أنا كنت مصور دائما أظهر جمال غزة طبيعة، لأني أنا بسكن في أقصى شمال غزة اللي هي مدينة بيت لاهيا. مدينة بيت لاهيا بتشتهر في الطبيعة والفراولة وهذه الأشياء. ما بعد الأجواء الجميلة موجود أحداث واقعة على أرض غزة. كنت أغطي الأحداث يعني من بداية حرب 2000 من عند 2016 كان في تصعيدات وهيك ومسيرات وحروب، لعند 2023 و24 حتى هذه اللحظة وإحنا بنغطي الحروب.
Going back to the movie, in many distressing situations, like the suicide bombing, Lee looks jaded and callous. I feel like it's a bit like the images they put on cigarette packages with rotting lungs and limbs and all the horrible things that smoking does to your body. The first time they are horrifying, but then they're still disgusting, but you get a little used to it. So do you think that also happens to your photos? And do you think that happens to you? Do you become callous?
This is a complicated question.
So it's a good one.
It's a good one. Yeah, it is a good one. You're asking very good questions, actually. You know?
Thank
so
you.
for someone who's just discovered the topic, you've done your research. I don't feel desensitized at all. In a weird way, I feel more sensitive than I used to. I'm speaking for myself. You know, maybe others.
Lindsay said the same, by the way.
Earlier in my career, anyhow, you know, when I was in my early 20s. I don't know how old are you, by the way?
I'm 32.
32. Okay. I mean, if you remember being in your early 20s, you know, at least for me, I was more wrapped up in myself, my own ambitions, my own insecurities. There was a lot of noise inside my head getting in the way of honestly confronting my emotions. We're also, you know, men in a society that often doesn't encourage men to be honest with their emotions.
Yes, totally.
So, you know, the passage of, so in a weird way, when I was seeing more violence, I was less sensitive to it because of all the noise in my head. Now, you know, thanks to time, thanks to age, thanks to therapy, thanks to, you know,
family,
mind-altering psychedelics, thanks to family, thanks to all sorts of things. You know, I have to be honest about what all the various qualities that go into it. I mean, thanks to family, thanks to love, thanks to friendship. You know, all these things make one much more sensitive. And, you know, ironically, I don't know if that makes me a better photographer. On some level, perhaps it makes me a worse photographer because I don't have the stamina I used to have. I don't have I can't be as unflinching as I used to be.
I think that's one of the things about Civil War that I found a little problematic because I felt, you know, I think Kirsten Dunst did a great job of being a war photographer. And look, there are a lot of war photographers who are totally stoic. But I personally could not relate to her stoicism because I'm a very emotional person. I'm the kind of person who feels what I see and what I photograph. And yes, I have the camera sort of as a divider between me and what's going on, and I continue to do my work. But I would say it's not to say when I get in the car or when I get home to edit, I'm not emotional.
I think that over time, I have become more sensitive to people I photographed because in some cases, I see what happens to them years later, right? I not very often, but once in a while. And I realize that these things that I document, these little pieces of history, are just a moment for me and my camera, sometimes much more than that. But for these folks, it's a change in their life that they'll never have again. The life that they had before and what comes next will never be the same. And I'm also thinking about things which are kind of mundane to mention. I'm thinking about whether I have the thing in focus. I'm thinking about whether my camera got bumped, the settings got bumped, and everything is underexposed. I'm thinking about things like that, and that keeps us hyper-focused in that moment. And so when there's a really emotional, traumatic situation happening, usually it's not affecting us then. It affects us later on. And in my personal case, it's often when I'm editing the photographs either later that day or the next day.
Every time I survived a war zone, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this. But here we are.
There's a moment when Lee seems to have an existential crisis. Despite all the photos of all the horrors in other countries, people don't seem to have learned the lesson. And here they are covering a civil war in the US. So, does Lee's resignation ring true? Do you ever lose faith in your photos?
I wish it were sufficient to end war, but the forces that provoke wars are not the same forces that usually lead people to want to document them, and there are many kinds of humans out there, and all you need is a few powerful, charismatic ones that want to create their place in history or expand their country's territories or resources, and they can manipulate enormous numbers of people. So I don't think that photographs and evidence of war on their own are ever enough to end war, or they would have. I mean, what more could we possibly need to see to convince us of the grotesqueness of it? At a certain point, how many pictures of guys shooting at each other can you possibly take? So, but I do think it's important, we all play our small role in society.
Ron, you covered 3 genocides, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. So I'm wondering, do you recognize yourself in this scene? I mean, never again must sound like a farce to you.
It's definitely an American, but possibly more just Western attitude that it's either all or nothing. If the work that we do doesn't stop the war, doesn't stop another war from happening, therefore the work has failed. And yes, I think that's a legitimate conversation to have. But in reality, based on my own experiences with my own work and having done this for so long and seen the impact of the work on the audience, but more specifically on the people in the photographs or people that are related to people in the photographs or foreign policy or other things, that the work can actually affect change, but maybe not in the grand way we want. But say I took a photograph in Darfur during the crisis there of a young girl about to go get firewood, risk her life, trying not to get to rape, to get firewood for her family to cook food and so on. And the photograph was used by Amnesty International, by UNICEF, to raise money, to raise awareness and so on for programming, for food, other things that would go back to Darfur. Whether or not that specific girl was ever directly helped as part of that, I'm not sure. I tried to find her. I wasn't able to. But the photograph helped people.
For example, during the war, early days of the war in Ukraine, in March of 2022, when Putin was repeatedly saying he would not target civilians and that he was, only targeting combatants. And then I was in a mortar attack that almost killed me, and it killed a family in front of me. And I made a photograph in that moment, and the New York Times chose to run that photograph on the front page. And that photo was used not only by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, but it was used sort of worldwide to show that, in fact, Russian troops were targeting Ukrainian civilians because it was a known civilian evacuation route. It didn't stop the war, but it certainly brought worldwide awareness, and it certainly brought more backing to Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine was getting the weapons it needed to defend itself. And so I think we can affect policy. I still believe that.
Well, there was a time years ago when I was covering the Iraq War. My goal was to educate the public so that they could make rational decisions when they went to vote in the next presidential election. Well, as it turned out, the Iraq War did not matter as much to us Americans as I thought it would, and it didn't really affect the election at all. And so sometimes we have to realize that what's important to us as photojournalists in the field, things that are so important that we're willing to even risk our lives, might not be important to others back home, and that's a tough thing to realize. And so ever since then, I consider it my goal, not necessarily to change a government policy, although that would be nice sometimes. My goal really is to educate folks on what's happening.
It's not only about change, right? It's about keeping a record. This is what other photographers told me. You're keeping a record, and with that can come accountability.
Absolutely. I think, like, when we go back to, let's say, go back to World War II, go back to the Holocaust, when Churchill, Roosevelt were asked, why didn't you bomb the railroad tracks? Why didn't you do this to save the Jews and so on? The response was quite easy. Oh, we didn't know, so we didn't do it. You fast forward to Rwanda in '94, Bosnia, the same time period, with President Clinton in the United States, Helmut Kohl, Mitterrand, and so on. CNN is going live from Sarajevo. The day in, day out of footage of the genocide in Rwanda. People, Kofi Annan couldn't say, "Oh, we didn't know," from the UN. It's like, yes, you did know. You chose to ignore it, and you need to be held accountable for it.
No international journalists are allowed in Gaza, so your photos are essential to document what's happening. Do you think they can also bring change?
هو صراحة هذه الحرب كانت غير عن أي حرب، لأنه الحرب هذه العالم كله عرف مدى إجرام الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وما نشاهده الآن في الجامعات الأجنبية، الجامعات في أمريكا، المسيرات التي تخرج في جميع دول العالم توضح أن العالم أجمع عرف جيدا أن الاحتلال الإسرائيلي هو مجرم. تمام. فأنا رسالتي للعالم راح أظل مستمر في إظهار إجرام الاحتلال، ما يفعله في الأطفال، ما يفعله في النساء، ما يفعله في المواطنين، ما يفعله في الشباب.
Help you folks? Just looking for gas.
300 for half a tank and 2 cans.
300 buys you a sandwich. We got ham or cheese?
300 Canadian.
Okay.
And then what happens is that Jessie steps out of the car and walks around the corner, and she seems attracted by something horrific she has glimpsed. It's 2 men hanging from their wrists, covered in blood. And I want to ask something about that attraction. It's a very difficult question to ask, and maybe it's a bit offensive and naive, but I'm gonna try anyway. Here's the thing. You take beautiful pictures of horrible things. Is there something attractive about horror? A bit like when there's a car accident and you know that there's traffic also because people slow down when they pass by because they want to look. So is there something seducing in horror?
I do think horror and beauty are much closer to one another than we'd like to think or imagine.
No, I absolutely agree. I think my aesthetic is very deliberate. It's essentially it's a seduction of using the aesthetics, color, composition, light, to have an emotional connection between the viewer and the image, even if it's something very difficult. Because I want you to not be able to look away, and then when you can't look away, you understand the content.
People are dying violent deaths all the time. These violent deaths are recorded all the time by film, by photographs, by eyewitnesses. What is to distinguish one death from another?
And using the traffic accident thing is perfect, right? Like, oh, that could have been me. Let's see what happened. Oh, maybe I can tell what they did wrong, so I don't do it wrong, or just this sort of fascination of what happens when things go completely wrong. And I think it's
And the movie too, right? We are watching apocalyptic movies, literally.
Yeah, I think exactly like this is, and I think that the film is in some ways a bit of a warning for not just the United States but for many countries on what could go wrong.
So I do try to make pictures beautiful, even when they're in ghastly situations. Now, granted, I try not to include gore in my pictures, and I try to photograph people in a way that's respectful to them. I don't want people to look ridiculous when they're in a traumatic situation. It's not my goal to make them look horrible or foolish or take advantage of their vulnerability. And so, yes, I want to make pictures that are aesthetically pleasing, otherwise people won't look at them.
And I also want to acknowledge that it's very provincial of me to sit here and complain about modern spectators enjoying violence as a spectacle, because that violence is far from me and I can choose to ignore it, but that's a privilege. And for many people, it's not the case. And so I think it's important to flip the perspective and ask, what do the photographed think? What do the people that suffer this violence think? Do they want their suffering to be represented?
You're talking about kind of armchair critics that have basically zero frame of reference for what they're talking about, making broad, sweeping commentaries with a lot of self-righteousness. I mean, that's a big part of the culture in general about many issues. I mean, I've never had a lot of regard for people that shoot first and ask questions later, or people that speak with authority about things they do not know themselves. So I honestly, you can hear the heat in my voice, but I also just tend to dismiss these things out of hand because it's not. It makes no sense to me.
It's so easy to comment.
It just too. I try to avoid commentary on things that I don't feel confident about commenting on. It's like the old Bob Dylan line, you better know your song well before you start singing. So
sounds like a good journalist.
Yeah, well, it's you try and a flawed. I make plenty of mistakes. I mean, this is the nature of things: is being honest with yourself about what you can do and what you can and who you are. But back to your question, I've had moments where I've overstepped boundaries and overstepped people's privacy, and they've reacted negatively. And of course, at that moment, you apologize, you step back, you feel bad about that. I would say I'd say that's a lot more rare than people might expect. By and large, I think also if you're being smart and thoughtful and kind of kind and respectful in your approach, people tend to want to be photographed, have these moments of pain, because the hope is that it then has some meaning. This like senseless, horrific loss will somehow mean something other than just the finality of death and despair. I would feel that way.
The interaction between the photojournalist and these folks is really important because, anyone can imagine someone they don't know comes in with a camera and starts photographing without speaking to them. And they're in a moment of distress. Well, instead of that, go up and talk to someone and say, I can't believe what you're going through today. And I'm very sorry. I'm trying to document this so people can understand what's happening. If you don't mind, I'd like to stay. And you get a whole different reaction. And that's how the pros that I know in this profession deal with the folks that they're photographing. It's not just running in and snapping images. It's a lot more sensitive. And the people who have longevity in this profession are people who function in that way.
Hey, out of interest, but are you guys aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America?
Oh, sure, but we just try to stay out.
Stay out.
With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Yeah.
Well, let me know if you want to try anything on.
For a movie about a civil war, it doesn't really show many civilians. Like, there's a lot of journalists and soldiers, but these people in this town are a rare example of civilians, and all they try to do is to ignore the civil war. And this reminds me of how a lot of people today just don't want to see any more news at all. You know, we talk a lot about news fatigue and news avoidance, and how people are tired of scrolling their Instagram and finding among videos of happy dogs and funny cats suddenly another war image. So, are you afraid that that happens to your work as well?
Look, I mean, unfortunately, I believe that it's important for people to see what's happening around the world, especially, if your country, or in the case of my country, I'm American, contributes to that war in some way. If we're sending troops, if we're sending tax dollars, if we're sending whatever, I think Americans have a responsibility to understand what's going on in those places. So I believe fundamentally in the fact that even if this image makes you uncomfortable, you probably have to take a look at what's happening.
So we saw this in Syria, 12 years of war. People are like, by year number 3, it's like, okay, whatever, more dead Syrians, whatever. Now you're starting to see it to some extent with Gaza as we pass 6 months. We already see it for sure with Ukraine. Oh yeah, okay, another city in Ukraine's bombed. So what? That's not the right attitude, in my opinion. I think it's very difficult, but it's not the right attitude. Like the attitude should be like, why are these things still happening?
It's human nature to turn away and to turn a blind eye from what's horrible. I think so. In that sense, one of my jobs as a photojournalist is to try to find a way to tell a story in a way that maybe is not overly graphic, that can convey a story in a way that is sensitive, that evokes emotion, but that doesn't necessarily make you want to never read a newspaper again.
Is there any photo recently that you think people should see?
There's the one of the mother that just won World Press, cradling her child. I think, and again, that's not too graphic, and I think that's one of the reasons why it spoke to so many people, because you just see the mother's pain.
لدينا الكثير من الصور هذه قوية جدا رغم إنه ما فيها دماء. صراحة في مشاهد كثيرة جدا ما نشرناها لأنه إحنا ما بنرضاها على أنفسنا، رغم إنه المشاهد اللي بتنتشر كلها هاي مشاهد بالنسبة لنا عادية، لأنه في مشاهد صعبة جدا 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 لا يوجد وصف لها. لكن الكثير من الناس حاليا في هذه الحرب لأنه شاعر نفسه مظلوم، فهو بيرضى على نفسه إنه إحنا ننشره ونتحدث للعالم فيه.
It's one of the unfortunate aspects of the movie that, at least in some scenes, it depicts journalists as war junkies, adrenaline junkies. I'm thinking of when the veteran writer smiles to the young photographer while they're being attacked by an helicopter.
That particular shot.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's a bit perpetuating, don't you find?
It can be, and I am a fan of the movie. I like the movie. I thought that Kirsten Dunst did an incredible job as the veteran photographer in depicting some of the long-term issues that we face psychologically after witnessing so many things over time. But of course, the movie has some issues.
I think that the adrenaline thing is really, and I think it's a little bit perpetuated by movies like Civil War, where it's just like this constant adrenaline rush through a war. I think that the what we need to see is the quiet time and the downtime and the toll that conflict takes and why we do it.
I'll say this: I don't have any serious colleagues in this profession who do it for adrenaline. That comes along with it.
But the problem is even bigger, because at the very end, when the soldiers drag the president out of his desk, the same journalist stops them from shooting him and says, "I need a quote." He gets the quote and he then lets them execute him. Now, the director, Garland, said that he wanted journalists to be the heroes of his movie.
I'm completely over this demonization and villainization of the press. It's been happening a lot. It comes from politicians, and it comes from within social media, which is this weird public discourse space that doesn't really relate to how people talk to each other at all. We all know that, right? And in some places it happens within the press, but whatever it is.
And it's very good that he talks about this issue, but I'm not really sure if he succeeded in the movie. I mean, this I think is a perfect example of how journalists can turn people into news items and dehumanize them. This is the opposite of good journalism. This is the opposite of what a good photo does.
I know. I found it very difficult and very uncomfortable. But to be honest with you, I've been in that situation to an extent several times, where unfortunately that I was not able to stop people from being executed, and that was what was going to happen, and there's nothing I could do. And there have been other times when I was able to say, "Don't kill these people," and either my presence there with the camera, my presence as a white Westerner, or my presence of actually just saying, "Take them prisoners," which happened one time in Afghanistan in 2001 with the battle for Kabul, that they captured 2 young Taliban soldiers and they were going to kill them. And I said, "No, don't kill them. You should take them prisoners and give them to the Americans." And the guys go, "Okay, we're going to go do that." And that was fine. And then in Bosnia, I was with militia and executed unarmed civilians right in front of me, telling me the whole time, "Don't take any photographs." So I did. I needed to document what was obviously was a war crime and the aftermath of the war crime, and the photographs were used as evidence in the War Crimes Tribunal to indict many people and help convict them of war crimes. But unfortunately, at that moment, and nobody will ever know except for the journalists themselves, if you could have stopped it or not stopped it. I felt there was nothing I could do, and all I could do was make sure that there was evidence of the crime.
I've never witnessed anything like that. Sometimes you see bad behavior from other journalists, photographers. It's where people are human, or sometimes they're being foolish. Sometimes they've been at it too long. I also can say that a lot of my kind of colleagues and friends in this profession are amongst the most thoughtful, honorable, courageous people I've ever met, and so I tend to not appreciate these caricatures. I don't think they're accurate.
You would never have a journalist asking someone to stop from assassinating or killing that person until they got a quote. that person would not be in the business for very long.
It's so callous. I just need a quote and then go ahead and kill him. I don't care. At the same time, I think if I was there, obviously as a photographer, I would have been doing what Jesse did. But as a journalist, I don't think I would have. I don't know. I don't think I would have asked any. I would have I would have said, maybe I would have said, "Don't kill him." I don't know.
I want to end by asking, why do you do what you do? François Truffaut once said that every movie against war ends up being pro-war. And I don't know if Civil War succeeded or not at being against war. But one thing it shows, I think, is that war is hell, but it's also maybe not attractive, but addictive. And there's a bit in your book where you say, we feel more comfortable in the darkest places than we do back home, where life seems simple and too easy. Can you talk about that?
Yes, when I was covering the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Darfur, back-to-back combat, I was literally flying from one war to another and going home basically where I was living in Istanbul to do laundry, and then I would get back on the plane and go. And so I felt at that time that I could really only relate to people who did similar work. For me, I felt the most comfortable when I was not necessarily in a war zone, but surrounded by people who understood what I had witnessed and what I continue to witness.
And given that history, again, often happens through conflict, it's important that we are there to document. We are there to amplify voices that need to be heard. And as much of it is a cliche, it is true to shine a light to remind people what's going on that they might not be paying attention to.
To me, are we just trying to provoke emotion with our images? Or are we trying to also provoke a certain amount of understanding? To me, emotion is a casual feeling. It can be deep, but it also can be fleeting. I want to try and take images and create works that have a really sustained relationship that hopefully have, a deeper impact over time.
It's my job as a photojournalist to keep them interested. And if they're turned off from the news, maybe I'm not doing my job well enough. And so I take that as a personal challenge. You have to look at a familiar topic in a different way. And if you don't do that, people will not pay attention, no matter how strong that picture is.
الناس دائما بتسألنا سؤال: انت كيف انت ما بتحس، انت ما عندك قلب، انت كيف انت مش بني آدم، انت كيف بتشوف المشاهد هاي؟ بصراحة احنا بشر، إنسان وإلنا قلب بنحس، لكن في الليل ما حدا بيكون جنبنا واحنا بدنا نيجي ننام او بدنا نيجي نقعد مع انفسنا. احنا كتير بنبكي مع انفسنا، انا كتير ببكي مع نفسي، انا نفسيا تعبان، من جواتي تعبان. في بعض الاحيان انا انهار ودموعي تنزل، انا انسان دموعي بتنزل، لكن نضغط على انفسنا في نفس اللحظة حتى نكون اقوى. لكن احنا من الداخل تعبانين والله، يعني لا يوجد، يعني هو حرفيا لا يوجد قلب، يعني ما ضل شيء انه يحمل القلب. لهيك احنا زي ما بيحكوها بدناش نحكي انه بلدنا، لكن بنقوي انفسنا على المشاهد عشان نضل مستمرين. لكن احنا محتاجين سنوات طويلة حتى نتعايش او نتصالح من المشاهد اللي شفناها بصدق.